Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. So, today we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill. Now, as we are beginning John Stuart Mill, as a matter of fact, we are starting the last portion of our course. So, let me say a couple of words about the philosophers we're going to cover. So, in a very important sense, the four philosophers that we're going to cover next are going to be John Stuart Mill, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And I want to impart a certain vision to you. Throughout the years of teaching this course, I have come to read and understand these four names side by side. So my presentation of these four philosophers is going to be in dialogue with one another. And basically, I'm going to read them through the prism of one another. And I have a very controversial position. And my position is that these four philosophers are actually secretly in basic agreement. Now, I do encourage you to take my position with a grain of salt, but this is my perspective. This is my best attempt at trying to understand these philosophers. Now, all four are providing a certain, I would say, critical but also progressive vision of human politics. In many ways, the constellation of ideas of contemporary, democracy, liberalism, capitalism. In a nutshell, what is the best way of understanding society, right? And all four philosophers have a certain notion that human beings had certain intuitions since time immemorial about what is the right thing to do. And some of these intuitions might have been right, some of these intuitions might have been wrong. And what we basically need is we need a new science of society that will help us reorganize society in a better fashion. And these philosophers are to a larger or to a lesser extent optimistic about this. Obviously, Nietzsche is I think, most pessimistic and most skeptical about the potentiality of a collective project. But certainly, Nietzsche believes that it is possible for a human being to reorganize their own personal life through some sort of critical philosophical reflection on a different basis, right? That basically, to try to summarize all four philosophies, that human beings individually or collectively, or maybe individually and collectively, can take matters into their own hands, right? And in this sense, when we talk about the project of enlightenment, right? Remember, again, this notion that, there's a possibility of creating a science of politics. Like the scientific revolution allowed humanity to understand nature and to take control of nature. In a similar fashion, the science of society will allow human beings to reshape society in a more rational fashion. And we have seen the different versions of the project of enlightenment in the various thinkers, starting with Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example. But these four philosophers, I think, in a unique fashion, speak to us. These four names are our contemporaries. Now, let me explain something on the board. Now, Hegel is in brackets and with an asterisk, basically because Hegel is hard to interpret and there are religious interpretations of Hegel. But if we focus on the secular interpretation of Hegel, then Hegel falls within this list, comfortably falls within this list. But it has to be a special interpretation of Hegel. But having said that, of course, all four philosophers can be interpreted in various fashion, and in many ways, I will be mostly looking for arguments in these philosophers. Like, I'm using these philosophers as sets of toolboxes, right? And I'm going to take specific arguments which I think are productive. But again, the arguments that these philosophers offer, I think, are uniquely contemporary. It's like Marx, Mill, Nietzsche, and Hegel are more contemporary with respect to us as opposed to, let's say, Rousseau or Hobbes. That's what I'm driving at. And the two philosophers whom we'll talk about after we've dealt with these four names, who are going to be Michel Foucault and to some extent Jürgen Habermas, I feel that Foucault and Habermas write in response to these philosophers. within the fairway, basically, of these four philosophers, and like in dialogue with them. And in some sense, I want to say that sort of Foucault and Habermas do not really offer like alternative visions of politics, but they introduce certain wrinkles, certain nuances with respect to this picture. So, Mill, Marx, Nietzsche, and Hegel. Disparate philosophers, why do I think it appropriate to talk about them in a single context? So, again, I do invite you to take my presentation with a grain of salt, but I would say that the ultimate idea for all four philosophers is that, think back to the challenge of the sophists. Think back to Thrasymachus and Callicles. How do we know what is the right thing to do? The question of obligation. What should I do? So in some sense, the most important question of philosophy. I want to say that in all four philosophers, and again, I remind you that I'm going to focus on a secular interpretation of Hegel within this particular context, right? The word good doesn't really mean anything. This is most evident in Nietzsche, who talks about the death of God. God is dead. Sort of this revaluation of values. And the way I propose to understand this phrase is, we've already seen this in Hobbes. Nothing is good in and of itself. Whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it which he for his part calls good. But there is nothing simply and absolutely good or evil. We live in a deeply amoral universe. There is no source of value apart from agents, apart from particular agents or particular subjects who negotiate concepts of good. And again, a controversial assertion, but I want to say that for all four philosophers, ultimately, the way we understand the word good is by reference to interest. Again, when we talk about Hegel, talking about interest, it's mostly secular interpretation of Hegel. We'll talk about this more, but sort of, I think broadly speaking, we can make this picture work. It's going to be also problematic with respect to Nietzsche. Is Nietzsche really talking about interest? Is he talking about happiness? And Nietzsche is a notoriously difficult philosopher to interpret. I'm going to try to advance some arguments. I'm going to try to show some quotes from Nietzsche to this extent. Of course, again, take it with a grain of salt, but that's going to be my basic notion. That again, nothing is good in and of itself. The notion of goodness is only relative to the interest, which in itself, interest is relative to a certain kind of human nature. So, I talk about interest, human nature, human interest, human nature, right? So like if we had galactic federation of aliens, then we would have to find commonality between human nature and alien nature, right? But barring these sci-fi scenarios, science fiction scenarios, I'm talking about important, robust assumptions about human nature. So human nature defines human interest. The difference of interest makes society necessary, in the words of Rousseau. The commonality of interest makes society possible, right? And all four philosophers, I feel, in an important respect, again, with wrinkles and nuances, are going to say that reason in its own right cannot legislate. So all four will reject Kantian picture that pure reason, reinen praktischen Vernunft, that pure reason can give us a basis for morality. And in fact, in one way or another, it is our passions or considerations of happiness, if you want, that tell us what is the right thing to do. And again, this is more or less problematic within these four philosophers, to a larger or lesser extent. But I think this is the overarching framework. And the cash value of this statement, and now I think this is much more robust than the things I've been talking about before, is that there is no such thing as an unconditional obligation for Mill, for Marx, for Nietzsche, or for Hegel. Now, I think this is very true for all four. Humans are, in some deep metaphysical sense, maybe, I don't know, born free. So we can only be legitimately obliged with our own consent. And in fact, maybe for our own interest. So all obligation always has to be conditional obligation. We can be obliged to do something. We take duties only with our own consent. And in terms of individual ethics, we're going to talk about, again, ideas of happiness, freedom, especially this notion of free development, right? In terms of individual interest, we're talking about morality, we're talking about individual interest. But when we try to build a vision of politics, we have to imagine something like common interest. Again, this is very clearly brought to the fore in Mill and in Marx, and I think it's very clear for both Mill and Marx that there's no such thing as justice with capital J. There's only small j justice, which bottoms out in a common interest. And Marx, in the German ideology, has this famous phrase where he talks about how in communism there is no difference between altruism and egoism. The communist society does not demand that individuals sacrifice their interests to the society as a whole. It's not about sacrifice. No, it is about true unity of interest, right? And so, is there a potentiality for collective project in Nietzsche? Can you have a society of the Übermenschen? It's an interesting question. I'm going to argue probably yes. Controversial position, but we'll get there. But lastly, I suppose I want to talk about these three words and three concepts: happiness, freedom, and equality. And I think it's going to be very important for us to try to disentangle the relationship between these three normative concepts, right? But ultimately, I want to say we have this vision of development, free development. Remember Aristotle, quasi-Aristotelian ideal. Human beings become happy when they bloom. Like imagine flowers in full bloom. When we develop our rich and varied abilities. This notion of maybe a human being like a work of art. Nietzsche is going to talk about this. But certainly development is going to be very important, right? For Mill, for Marx, for Nietzsche, and for Hegel. All four have a special feeling for human creativity. All four would probably agree on some particular examples of human excellence, like Goethe, for example. Right? I think Goethe for Mill and for Marx and for Nietzsche and for Hegel would be an example of an excellent individual. Like this is what humanity exists for the cultivation of these kinds of individuals, right? But very importantly, it's an individual ideal, but it's an individual ideal which is uniquely enabled by culture, which is uniquely enabled by humans working together. And this is the Aristotelian, I feel, an important Aristotelian element in all four philosophers. Somebody like Goethe can only exist against the background of a culture. And Marx has this phrase that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And I suppose in some sense you could say that the free development of all, human culture, is a condition for the free development of each, right? And these four philosophers are going to emphasize different elements of this picture. But I feel that there's a broad similarity, a broad consensus among these four names. That again, happiness, true human happiness, is impossible without development. And development, in order to really be organic and proper human development, has to have an element of freedom. So you could say that happiness is impossible without development. Development is impossible without freedom. So freedom is uniquely valuable for happiness. Maybe instrumentally valuable. Freedom may be instrumentally valuable or may be valuable for its own sake. And then equality is a problematic concept. Let me. I feel it's very important to underscore. I don't think that any philosopher would say that equality in its own right is a good thing. We can all be equally poor or equally dead. What is the value in that? But there are certain kinds of equality, like for example, equality before the law or equality of opportunity, which are necessary for freedom and for development. And so, tentatively, in some fashion, I feel that there's a relationship between these concepts. And the strong assertion that I am making is that among the four philosophers, again, Marx, Mill, Nietzsche, and Hegel, the relationship between these three concepts is similar. It's like there's a common ground for dialogue between them. And even if, you could ask for relative importance of, let's say, happiness and freedom, there's room for productive dialogue between these four philosophers. So in a certain important sense, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I feel that the most important task for political philosophy in the 21st century, and again, I remind you of my philosophical allegiance. With the ancient Greeks, I believe that philosophy is a deeply practical enterprise. Philosophy should be to the soul what medicine is to the body. And philosophy should be to the body politic what medicine is to the physical body, right? So political philosophy, I feel, has this important practical goal of enlightening political life, right? And in this sense, I feel that reading these four philosophers, again, Mill, Marx, Nietzsche, and Hegel, is uniquely important for us in order to understand what are the true goals of politics and what is the best way to achieve them.